Great to be here, guys. Delighted so many could turn up. And I have a little story today about atherosclerosis and heart disease mechanisms. Are people interested in that? Okay.
Happy Sunday, guys. Well, there was a lot of interest in my interview with Vladimir Subbotin I released the other day, and his accent is quite thick and we didn't have too many slides. So a lot of people asked me, can you explain it in more detail? And here we go. This is my talk from Denver in March 2020, just before I had to rush out of the country because the scam started. In any case, I was on stage and I gave a big talk on Professor Subbotin's theories and data and added some of my own. So this, I think, is probably one of the best talks you can ever see on the actual pathogenesis of LDL cholesterol invading your arteries. And I think after this, you won't have any real questions anymore about the whole nonsense of the thing. And don't forget, at ivorworkshops.com, you can engage in several-hour sessions with myself on various topics like mental strength, psychology, and of course weight loss coming up next week. And I have lots of workshops, and I'll have more going forward, where we have interactive audience and we go through worksheets and exercises, and you really walk away with key takeaways to improve your life in many different aspects. So ivorworkshops.com, and with that, here's me in Denver, March 2020, just before the storm.
Great to be here, guys. Delighted so many could turn up. And I have a little story today about atherosclerosis and heart disease mechanisms. Are people interested in that? Okay. It's good. It's a big deal. So, kudos to our small team we've developed over the last few months to investigate this sphere that I'm going to talk to you about today. So we have Professor Vladimir Subbotin, a pathologist, who's published on what I'm going to talk about. And also we have a bunch of Irish, American, Australian pathologists and doctors who are on our little team. So pathogenesis, or the progression of atherosclerosis, is it inside out? So the LDLs in your bloodstream, those pesky little creatures, actually migrate into your intima, the inner lining of your arterial wall, from the bloodstream. And that's the Orthodox view. And it's quite a dogma, I might say. And just a quick clarification, that's not Dr. Thomas Dayspring there, though it does resemble him. So is that the case inside out, or is it possible that it's outside in? You know, that would be very interesting, and it would change our whole view of atherosclerosis initiation. And that is the view published on by Professor Subbotin, a few publications. So we're working through this now to see how correct it might be. So last year, disclosure, I went through the inside-out orthodox theory in great detail and explained it. So I came over all orthodox on you guys. But importantly, I described this theory of the LDLs coming from the bloodstream into the arterial wall, but I clarified there are many layers by which they have to traverse. You know, the glycocalyx, the endothelial single cell layer, they have to get trapped in the subendothelial intima, proteoglycans entrap them, and the all-important HDL efflux. So HDL removes excess cholesterol from the intima and takes it away. So that's a very important part of the system. But I made the point that if indeed LDLs come via this route, it is only almost exclusively due to negative factors that I would call the primary root causes of atherosclerosis progression. So it's not so much the LDLs, even if this mechanism is true. It's the primary root causes that enable this transport. So we should always think of the root causes rather than just a number of particles. But that said, let's get on with the other theories. So a short history of cholesterol. Anich Koff, a century ago essentially, came up with the initial cholesterol hypothesis. And then for around 60 or 70 years, not a whole lot happened. But in the 70s and 80s, there was tension because new people with new science were questioning this hypothesis. And there was a lot of tension building as to whether it was correct hypothesis. So we saw at that time then the Time magazine, you know, cholesterol will kill us, and it was a kind of a crazy period. But the NIH consensus meetings were brought about, and these meetings were to lock it down whether the cholesterol hypothesis was true or not. And from then on, no one shall speak word against it, right? And I heard rumors that the outcome was decided before the meetings even started, but there you go. This was the outcome, that elevation of blood cholesterol levels is a major cause of coronary artery disease. So that's a very clear message. It's not a cause, it's a major cause. It's the big deal. And there was solidarity around that after the conference. A lot more publications then detailed this over the ensuing years, and it was established without question that lipids enter the arterial wall directly from the arterial lumen, or the center where the blood flows. That's how they get in, inside out. And there was absolute solidarity around that also. So we'll focus on this bit. The lipids enter from the inside. Now, the LDL pathway described was established in a paper by Hansen, and it has over 15,000 citations. So this is locked down, that the lipids come from the inside out. And I'll just show you an illustration from that paper. And we see on the left there that the intima, the inner wall lining, is kind of empty except for some fibers and maybe collagen. So it's gasping for LDLs to come in from the bloodstream, willy-nilly. And then to the right you see that the LDL and cholesterol in the wall becomes a problem, which we'd all agree on. It's not really supposed to be there, and you get the progression of atherosclerosis. But this idea that the intima is kind of empty and thin and just gasping for particles, that's not entirely true. So I'm going to use Subbotin's diagrams now to explain the morphology of the arteries, or how they're made up. And here we see a small artery, and we see the endothelium is the inner single cell lining. That's a single cell thick. The intima then is the next layer in, and it's shown here quite thin because it's a small artery. Then we've got the media, which is shown as much relatively bigger, and the adventitia on the outside. So they're the main layers. If we look at a cross-section of a small artery, we see the intima, very small, media thick, adventitia somewhere in the middle. That's a very small artery, but below I'm showing a large, or a coronary artery, and it's very different. So the little intima we see up top is actually a much bigger structure in a coronary artery. And the relatively big media in a small artery is actually smaller than the intima in a big artery. And Subbotin noted that this design of coronary arteries pertains to all humans without any exception. There's no discussion on this. The coronary arteries are utterly different, with a 30-cell deep, thick intima. And to illustrate, here we see a 7-day-old. The black line is kind of the intima area. It's tiny, and the media is in yellow. It's quite thick relatively. A 5-year-old, we see the intima growing naturally as the arteries get bigger, carry more pressure. A 15-year-old, the intima is almost the width of the media. And a 30-year-old even, we see the big, thick, diffuse intimal thickening that's physiologic and normal. And a 50-year-old is going to be bigger again. And anyone who has atherosclerotic problems, it's going to be bigger again, right? Because the intima is a rapidly cell-reproducing tissue, one of the most so in the body. And any insults to it or any issues, and it will rapidly replicate. This differentiation of coronary intima into multicellular layered compartment occurs in all humans without exception. So you can accept that this is the fact. We see this in many studies, 30 cells thick, but the main cholesterol hypothesis papers always show it as a kind of a empty with some fibers chamber, right? And this is actually incorrect. It's not shown as it really is. But we have many, many, many publications in the cholesterol world that all show the incorrect morphology. This one is kind of amusing because they do show an intima that's as thick as the media, so they're getting close to the truth. But notice that they're at pains to say in the narration, the normal intima is a very thin region. Size is exaggerated in this figure. So they actually call out in words that they're incorrect, which is kind of interesting. So why? Why would all these cholesterol publications be wrong? Seems kind of odd. Now, Subbotin suggests the reason is quite simple. A depiction of the real coronary human artery morphology is not suitable for the cholesterol hypothesis. Okay, that's his idea. Which is, of course, that lipids enter the arterial wall directly from the lumen. And if you show a 30-cell deep, dense structure, it kind of makes it a bit awkward wondering how they go through. So I think that might be why they leave all that awkward stuff out. So a lot of analysis luckily has been done on how the lipids build up in that intima. And there's some extraordinary work from Nakashima and others. And I'm going to go through it now. So I'm going to show you cross sections of arteries with a visual view, that's just a light microscope, with a lipid view where they stain red any cholesterol, so you can see where the cholesterol begins to build up, and an immune cell view where they stain for macrophage. So here we have basically the LDLs are shown there, and they're in the blood just at the edge of the intima, and the little arrowheads are where the intima ends, and below that is the media layer. So this is normal intimal thickening, like I showed you earlier. It's healthy, normal. Here's early lipid buildup, and hopefully you notice that the lipids, the cholesterol, is building up right down at the bottom of the intima, right at the interface with the media. So the LDLs are up in the blood. If they're coming in, why is the cholesterol building up only in the distal or deepest layers? We have more lipid buildup in the later stage, and again you see a band of cholesterol in red there in the center diagram, all building up in the deepest intima, but no traces of cholesterol on the journey to the deepest intima by these LDLs, if they were bringing it in. Excessive lipid now, it begins to expand up through the intima, and you got a bit of a mess, and you can also see tendrils of red going down to the media there, and even some cholesterol in the media. This is pathological intimal thickening, and now you've got a real problem. And again, we see all the cholesterol in the bottom, but it's migrated all over the place. And the macrophage on the right, you see that there are a lot of macrophage coming in to try and deal with the mess. And pathological intimal thickening with macrophage and foam cells, now it's a hot mess. And now we're heading towards events, heart events, effectively. Many publications record this pattern I've just shown you. They don't get a lot of circulation or a lot of discussion, but it's in the literature in many places. So Subbotin then, and his outside-in hypothesis, how could this be true? You know, what a charlatan, eh? So he suggests that it may very well be at the early stages that the LDLs come in from the outside. So I'll go through that. So here's his diagram pulled from his 2016 paper, very comprehensive paper. You'll see the lumen there where the blood flows, the intima, and then the media. And we'll bring in some new characters. And the new characters are the vasa vasorum, the arteries of the arteries. And they basically feed around 2/3 the way across the media to bring in nutrients. And they actually can nourish the intima by diffusion of small molecules, and the intima can also be nourished from the lumen side, like oxygen and small molecules can diffuse in. So the intima needs to be nourished like any tissue, and it gets it from both sides. But look what happens when the intima is insulted by any of the root causes of atherosclerosis, and you'll see that the vasa vasorum begin to project through the media and down towards the intima. They get signal to come in to help when the intima is offended. And you see that the tips of the vasa vasorum can penetrate the base of the intima, and because the tips of vasa vasorum are growing vessels, they're fenestrated, they're very leaky, that's their nature, they can easily leak blood components. So you could easily get cholesterol and lipoproteins getting in here in this manner. And from our earlier graphs I showed, that's exactly where the cholesterol begins to build. That's pretty unambiguous. The vasa vasorum, Subbotin would suggest, are called in hotspots of arterial damage, intimal insult, and they begin the process of cholesterol building where it really shouldn't be. Now, the normal coronary arteries have vasa vasorum. Thick-walled structural arteries have vasa vasorum to nourish the thick walls. But atherosclerotic coronary arteries have way more vasa vasorum, and they penetrate right into the plaque in the intima, as you can maybe see there. And in fact, the mainstream accepts that the vasa vasorum are a massive part of atherosclerosis progression. Drawings like these make it obvious. So the mainstream does accept this for later progression. So if we look at Subbotin now and we look at the later progression, we get past the initiation of atherosclerosis and we look at the really important progression that leads to death, cardiac arrest, etc. We look at that later phase, which is really the big thing. Subbotin would say that the vasa vasorum are an enormous part of that mechanism, bringing in inflammatory molecules and many other functions. The orthodoxy, ironically, would generally agree that for this major phase of atherosclerosis, they'd accept vasa vasorum is hugely involved. Yet they're agreed. For the early initiating step, however, these guys are miles apart. The orthodoxy would say that the LDLs in the bloodstream in the lumen make their way to the endothelium, and then they do a little trick. They get to the base of the intima and get locked in there without leaving a trace of their passage. So I know some of you might be into quantum mechanics. Just got a little reminder there. And that's actually the way it is. It's as simple as that. It's a triumph of simplicity. And they get stuck down there. Okay. Subbotin would posit that any or all of the root causes of atherosclerosis that offend the intima and the endothelium, cause distress, will cause hyperplasia or cell replication in the intima. It's a hugely replicating tissue when it's under pressure. You'll get hypoxia, you'll get lack of oxygen, and it will send out a call for help, which we know happens. And the vasa vasorum will be asked to neovascularize or to bring in arterioles to help. And there is where certainly LDL particles can make their way directly into the base of the intima. So his theory is quite simple too. So we look at just what they both say. The orthodoxy say LDL particles diffuse across the endothelium, that's the single cell layer on the inside touching the blood, and or LDLs are actively transcytosed across the endothelium. So for the last 10 years it's become clear that LDL doesn't so much leak across the inner layer, but the cells of the endothelium, the inner single cell layer, actively take an LDL from the blood, engulf it through receptors, keep it complete across the cell, and then excitose it and pop it out into the wall of the artery. Now, it's a bit unusual that evolution would design the most complex machinery you can think of to actively bring in LDL after LDL in order to give us atherosclerosis. But that's a separate thing, but keep that in mind. The LDLs then, it's assumed, move freely across the intima, but we know it's a 30-cell deep layer and there's some questions around that. And having more LDL particles drives the problem, and this is the kernel of the orthodoxy hypothesis. More LDLs, more interlopers invade the intima. That is the basis. So in their worldview, the dominant root cause of atherosclerosis is essentially more LDL because it's central to them. And I've heard the words invasion, interlopers, and many other interesting words used for this process, almost like they're trying to vilify the LDL, which is also interesting. So Subbotin would say the intima is avascular. It has no arteries in it. It's avascular. It's nourished from the lumen and from the vasa vasorum, right, by diffusion. I think that's all accepted. Diffusion of LDL is limited, Subbotin would say, which prevents LDL crossing that intima, 30 cells, and getting to the bottom, in practical terms, and reaching the biglycans where it can get stuck. But the intima is exposed to any or all insults, and I put them in the yellow box there, and there's more. And that will cause hyperplasia, cell replication, distress, hypoxia, etc. can happen, lack of oxygen. That upregulates HIF1 and VEGF, very powerful signalers for angiogenesis or for artery creation and progression. The vasa vasorum then take the signals, infiltrate and vascularize the intima to nourish cells to deal with a problem. And this pathology, driven by real root causes, is what brings LDL into a forbidden zone where you have biglycan where they can get trapped, because the problem drove the inappropriate vascularization and inappropriately brought LDL into where it shouldn't be. And that's what the problem is. And importantly, for Subbotin's view of the world, or our team's view, the dominant root cause in this hypothesis is any or all forms of intimal or arterial insult, not really the LDL particles. Okay, so there's a different worldview with this hypothesis. I'll go through the evidence, but only at a high level, and I'm coming to the end now, actually. So for the orthodoxy, we could say the LDL can cross the endothelium, the inner single cell layer. We know that. But again, transcytosis actively bringing across LDLs to put them in the wall, it's hard to reconcile that with evolutionary science and logic. So that's a point against it. LDL can cross the endothelium through leaky junctions when the endothelium is under stress and there's death of cells and there's turnover. That can happen. But leaky junctions and endothelial stress are driven by the real root causes in the first place. So still not really the LDL. LDL could traverse across that intima. It could, but the entrapment is only in the deepest layers. You have no evidence of LDL on its journey. So that's a bit of a question mark. LDL could traverse that intima, yeah, but when I dig, I can mainly find papers that are mathematical models for that transverse movement across the intima. It's very hard to find any actual autopsy or papers demonstrating it. A lot of mathematical models, which are theoretical. Higher LDL numbers can exacerbate the problem, and that is true, but this applies to Subbotin's model too. You see, in his model, if you have more particles, more will get in when the vasa vasorum have been brought in. So this applies to both models, so it doesn't differentiate between the two hypotheses from the two groups. And you could say that the distal or deepest biglycan, the proteoglycans that are in the deepest intima, well, that could explain it because the LDL moves freely until it gets to them and then it gets stuck. But there are contradictions in the literature for this, where biglycan is shown in other areas of the intima, but we don't see LDLs getting stuck there. So there's quite a few questions there, but there is evidence for, and I hope I've been fair. For Subbotin, what's the evidence? Well, all the mechanisms are supportive, and it ties in with all of the long-term mechanisms for atherosclerosis progression. We know the vasa vasorum are a massive part of progression. But in fairness, against Subbotin, the vasa vasorum entering the intima at the earliest stage to bring cholesterol is not proven. It's not proven out. It's a hypothesis. We know the root causes drive intima insult, and that is the initiating step, essentially. And we know that intimal insult even drives biglycan production. So the biglycans being there that trap LDLs, they're not just there the same all the time. They are driven by the intimal insults on our root cause list. So that's kind of suggestive. Hyperplasia leads angiogenesis. So we know that hyperplasia and intimal challenge is before angiogenesis. It brings it in. And the tips of the vasa vasorum are leaky and fenestrated, so they are the types of vessels that would eminently allow lipoproteins to get out at their tips, right? So again, it's supportive. Outside in precedes endothelial distress. So there are some papers where infiltration of vasa vasorum and outside inflammatory components actually occur a couple of weeks before the endothelial distress shows up. So again, it's suggestive. And vasa vasorum precedes endothelial dysfunction in other papers. So again, there's a lot of circumstantial that says the vasa vasorum are in at a very early stage. Here's an interesting one from Dr. Travis on our team. He dug out a paper, perivascular adipose tissue, which is the fat wrapped around your coronary arteries. That's always required before you get atherosclerosis. It must be there. And he has another paper which proposes that perivascular fat around your arteries is a storehouse for oxidized LDL, and it actually feeds oxidized LDL from the outside in into the artery. So this is very thought-provoking, that mechanism. I've skipped that one for time. I'll go to the corneal vascularization data. And this is an interesting proof point supporting Subbotin's theory. So when you get lipid buildup in the eye relating to corneal transplants and issues of that nature, they have proven that microvessels come in like vasovasorum, neovascularization, comes into the eye before any lipids build up. And those little microvessels bring in the lipids. Otherwise, the lipids and cholesterol doesn't build up. So again, it's kind of a parallel to Subbotin's theory, and it's a nice proof point to support it. More than hypoxia drives vasovasorum, those HIF1 and VEGF that brings in the troops of vasovasorum, it's not just hypoxia. Many inflammatory markers and TNF-alpha, many issues related to diabetes, smoking, and many root causes will also trigger the signals for bringing in the vasovasorum. And I'll skip another one there, and I'll finish with HDL efflux. So does everyone know that HDL is crucially important to take excess cholesterol out of your intima before you develop a very big problem? Is everyone aware of HDL's importance? Yeah, it's pretty central now and proven out. But I always thought that HDL in the intima got cholesterol and engulfed it and then brought it out into the lumen, into the bloodstream. But what I found out recently from Gabor Erdoshi is that the HDL gets the cholesterol in the intima and it makes its way to the outside. So micro lymphatic vessels like vasovasorum take all the HDL and cholesterol out to the outside of the artery. So even all of that crucial efflux all relates to going out to the outside of the artery, not the inside, which kind of makes this all the more thought-provoking. So their worldview of these two groups. The orthodoxy, when you see studies like this, we have so many studies, and I'll just explain briefly. In this one, we see LDL going up higher and higher in a group of people, but for low blood pressure and medium blood pressure people, higher LDLs don't increase media thickness. They don't increase atherosclerosis in this study. But people with high blood pressure, then higher LDL does exacerbate their thickness. So it's an example that if you've got a genuine problem going on, a higher LDL can make things worse, right? And there's many examples of this. People with low insulin resistance, higher LDL doesn't make a difference, but people who are insulin resistant, higher LDL may show a signal. And the same for iron metabolism issues. And I could go on and on. LDL being higher showing an issue almost always links to the person having an underlying problem of some sort from the root cause list, generally. But the orthodoxy would call the LDL the root cause, in spite of what I just said. It's the LDL that's the big thing. And what would they say about all the real root causes that we view as fundamental? Well, they tend to say they're risk mitigation things. They're peripheral things. They're interacting factors that we can tweak to bring the risk down, but the focus is on the LDL. With Subbotin's world, the focus is on the root causes that cause arterial insult, intimal insult, and trigger the whole process. That's root cause. And in the engineering world I'm from, that would be root cause without a question. And we would call the LDL exacerbating when there's a problem present by being higher. We'd call that risk mitigation. Because if we couldn't fix the root cause, In engineering, we would take a factor like LDL and maybe lower it as a short-term measure to mitigate or lessen the problem, but we'd never call it root cause because of what I've told you. So last slide now, this is the high orthodoxy. This is boring all around the cholesterol inside-out theory. And he's published many papers, but this one is almost shouting at the crowd. So it's the central role of arterial retention of LDLs, essentially. And you can see I've underlined a triumph of simplicity. So they're basically saying, look, all you guys arguing about LDL, it's bloody simple, guys. It's what we said. They get in, they invade the intima, and that's your problem. And this is in current opinion in lipidology. It's probably not too surprising in lipidology that that would be the current opinion. But what did they say about what we value as the root causes of atherosclerosis progression? How did they cover them? Well, they have a table, and it's very revealing. They decided they're going to put a table as what's really important in the pathophysiology of atherosclerosis and what's kind of peripheral. And right up the top in their new table, they put LDL particles as causative. Top of the heap, that's the big thing. And the rest of the root causes, either they're exacerbating or they're bystanders, right? So in other words, all the other stuff in atherosclerosis, it's secondary to those nasty LDL particles, right? So we've got big differences of opinion. And this Subbotin hypothesis is important because if it's true, it will make it a lot clearer what's really root cause and what's really peripheral. So I think it's very important. And it is true that myself and our team are outside of proving this hypothesis at the moment, but I've no doubt in the next few months, don't worry, because we're going to be moving in. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that, guys, laying the old cholesterol nonsense to rest. And when I take a topic, technical or otherwise, I don't mess around, as I hope you'll agree. So ivorcumminsworkshops.com, I've got mental strength, critical thinking, weight loss, and I'm going to be adding more workshops going forward. And each one is around 2.5 hours. We get great interaction from the audience. I do live exercises. And my goal is for each workshop to take away key things you can immediately start changing in your life to improve your life. So that's the case with every workshop, and that's the goal. That the moment it's over, you can walk away, get the worksheets I'll send you, and basically improve your life greatly in any of the various areas. So hopefully you can come along, support, get involved, and I've put testimonials because I've only run a few, so I put some testimonials on the homepage of the website. That's ivorcumminsworkshops.com. Hope to see you soon.